It was just another chilly morning in Maplewood, a small, quiet town where nothing much ever happened, or at least, that's what people thought. The streets were lined with tall, bare trees, their branches swaying gently in the cold breeze. The sidewalks were empty except for a few early risers, bundled up in warm coats and scarves, hurrying to their jobs or morning errands. Birds chirped softly in the distance, their sounds blending with the distant hum of cars passing by. For Clara Winters, this was just another normal day. She woke up early, as always, feeling the familiar warmth of her cozy blanket before reaching out to the small bedside table. Her hand easily found what she was looking for, her cane. The smooth handle felt reassuring in her grip. Clara had been blind since birth, but she didn't let that stop her from living her life with confidence. With a gentle stretch, she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and let her bare feet touch the cool wooden floor. "Time for our walk, Max," she said softly. At the sound of his name, a soft woof came from the other side of the room. Max, her loyal guide dog, was already awake and ready. The golden retriever trotted over, his tail wagging gently as he nudged Clara's hand. His fur was warm and soft, and Clara smiled, feeling comforted by his presence. She reached for his leash, which hung neatly by the door, and fastened it with practiced ease. The two of them had their morning routine down to perfection. Max guided Clara out of her small house, carefully leading her down the 3 steps from the front porch to the sidewalk. The cool air hit Clara's face, and she pulled her coat tighter around her. As they walked, the familiar sounds of the town filled the air, the distant honk of a car, the laughter of children on their way to school, and the rhythmic tapping of her cane against the pavement. Everything felt just like any other day. But today, something was different. Clara couldn't see the way people glanced at her, but she could sense it. Passers-by slowed down as they walked past her, some whispering to one another, others simply watching. She could hear their soft murmurs and feel the weight of their stares. "What's different about me today?" Clara wondered silently. Maybe it was the way she walked. Her steps were always steady and sure, but today they felt even more confident. Or perhaps it was Max, who seemed more alert than usual. His ears twitched at the smallest sound, and his head turned quickly whenever someone approached. Clara could feel the tension in his body through the leash, and it made her wonder if something was wrong. A woman passing by with a stroller slowed down and took a long look at Clara and Max. The woman's toddler pointed at Max and giggled, but the mother hushed him quickly and walked on. Clara could hear the hurried footsteps fading away. Strange, Clara thought, adjusting her grip on the cane. She couldn't help but smile a little. Over the years, she had grown used to people underestimating her. Many thought that because she was blind, she needed help with everything. But Clara was strong and independent. She had learned to trust herself and, of course, Max. What the people of Maplewood didn't know was that Clara carried a big secret, one that nobody would have ever guessed. She wasn't just an ordinary blind woman walking her dog. No, Clara had been part of something much bigger, something that most people only read about in newspapers or watched in movies. She had worked with the police in secret, using her heightened senses to help solve cases that others couldn't. Clara could hear things most people missed, smell things they didn't notice, and sense details that went beyond sight. And Max? He wasn't just a guide dog, he was trained for much more than leading her down the sidewalk. But today, she wasn't thinking about her past. Today was just another morning walk, or so she thought. The cool air carried the smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, and Clara smiled. The scent reminded her of simpler days, when life wasn't so complicated. She had always loved Maplewood for its peace and quiet, but she also knew that quiet places often hid the biggest secrets. As she and Max continued down the street, the leash in her hand tightened slightly. Max had sensed something. He slowed down, his ears standing up straight. Clara felt it immediately. She stopped in her tracks and listened carefully. A group of young men stood by the corner, their voices low but filled with laughter. Clara could hear the sound of motorcycles parked nearby, their engines still warm and clicking softly as they cooled down. She could tell by their voices that they were watching her. "Hey, check out the blind lady," one of them whispered, but not softly enough. Clara kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard. But Max's tail stiffened, and Clara could tell he was on high alert. She could feel his muscles tense through the leash. Another voice spoke up, this time louder. "Bet she doesn't even know we're here," the man chuckled. Clara's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she held her head high and kept moving. She had dealt with people like this before, people who thought blindness made her weak. They didn't know that Clara had faced much worse than a few rude remarks. Still, something about this group made Max uneasy, and Clara always trusted Max's instincts. She decided to take a different route, turning down a quieter side street. Max guided her carefully, and Clara listened for any signs that they were being followed. Behind her, the laughter faded, but she still felt uneasy. "Let's go home, Max," she whispered, and they picked up their pace. As they reached the familiar path leading back to her house, Clara felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Something told her that today wasn't going to be as ordinary as she had hoped. She didn't know it yet, but this walk was the beginning of something much bigger. What people in Maplewood didn't realize was that Clara wasn't just any blind woman walking her dog. And today, they were about to find out the truth. She took a deep breath as Max led her up the steps to her house. "Good boy," she said, giving him a gentle pat. Max's tail wagged, but his eyes were still focused on something in the distance. Clara may not have been able to see it, but she could feel it, something was coming. And this time, she wasn't going to let anything catch her by surprise. Clara walked confidently down the sidewalk, her cane tapping gently in front of her, guiding her every step. Max, her loyal guide dog, walked beside her, his ears perked up and his body alert. The morning air was crisp, and the town of Maplewood seemed quiet and peaceful, just like any other day. But as Clara turned the corner onto Birch Street, something changed. The street, usually calm, felt different. There was a strange silence, broken only by the distant sound of a bird chirping and the soft hum of a car passing by. Then, suddenly, a deep, rough laugh echoed through the air. Clara stopped walking. Her grip on Max's leash tightened. She knew that laugh wasn't friendly. It was cold, mean, and full of trouble. Max stood still beside her, his body tense, his tail low. He could feel something wasn't right too. From behind, the low rumble of motorcycles filled the air. Clara listened carefully. The engines roared louder and louder, like growling beasts ready to pounce. The sound of heavy boots scraping against the pavement told Clara that they weren't alone anymore. A voice spoke up, sharp and mocking. Well, what do we have here?" The man's voice was filled with laughter, but it wasn't the kind that made you smile. It was cruel, the kind that made your stomach twist. "A blind lady out for a little stroll? Where's your human helper, sweetheart?" Clara could hear the smirks in their voices, the way they sneered and chuckled among themselves. She didn't need to see them to know they were trouble. Max let out a soft growl, low and quiet, but enough to warn Clara that they were getting too close. She could feel his muscles tense under the leash, ready to protect her if he needed to. But Clara stayed calm. She had faced challenges before, and she wasn't about to let a bunch of loud bikers scare her. The men laughed again, louder this time, as if they were enjoying themselves. Clara could hear the sound of boots circling around her. One of them must have walked right in front of her because she could feel the air shift. Then, without warning, she felt a tug. One of them had grabbed her cane. He yanked it slightly, playing with it like it was a toy. "What's this for, huh? You don't need it if you've got that dog doing all the work," he jeered, his voice dripping with amusement. Clara's heart pounded, but she didn't panic. She kept her grip strong, holding on tightly. She took a deep breath, staying calm. She knew better than to show fear. "Careful now," she said, her voice steady and firm. "You might regret what you're about to do." Her words were calm but carried a quiet strength that made the air around them shift. For a brief second, there was silence. The man holding her cane hesitated, as if he wasn't expecting such a strong response. Then, another biker revved his motorcycle, the loud noise vibrating through the ground. The sudden roar of the engine made Max take a step forward, his sharp eyes locked onto the noise, ready to act if Clara needed him. The men laughed harder. They didn't see Clara as a threat. To them, she was just a blind woman with a dog, walking alone. What could she possibly do? "You've got guts, lady," another voice said, this one deeper and gruff. "But guts won't help you here." Clara remained still, listening closely. She could hear their heavy jackets creaking as they moved, their footsteps shuffling on the pavement, and even the faint sound of a lighter flicking on and off in one of their hands. She could tell they weren't just passing through. They were looking for trouble. But what they didn't know was that they had picked the wrong person. Max was still by her side, unmoving but alert. His tail was stiff, and Clara could feel his chest rise and fall rapidly. She knew he was ready to protect her. Max wasn't just a guide dog, he was trained to sense danger and respond in ways that most people would never expect. Another biker stepped closer, his leather jacket brushing against Clara's sleeve. She could feel the warmth of his presence and the stink of his cigarette breath. "What's the matter?" he sneered. "Cat got your tongue?" Clara smiled slightly, tilting her head. "No," she replied. "I just don't waste my breath on people who don't deserve it." Her calm response caught them off guard. She could hear them murmuring to each other, and for a brief moment, they weren't sure what to do next. One of them muttered, "Man, let's just go. She's not worth it." But their leader, the one who had spoken first, wasn't ready to back down. "Nah," he said. "I think she needs a little lesson." Clara stood her ground. She could hear the leader stepping closer, his boots clicking against the sidewalk. Max's growl grew louder, more threatening this time. "Tell your dog to behave, lady," the man said, but Clara could hear the hesitation in his voice. She smiled again, but this time, there was something different in her tone. "Max doesn't like bullies," she said simply. The air felt heavy with tension. Clara could feel the weight of their stares, but she didn't move. She knew that they were waiting for her to show weakness, to back down. But Clara Winters never backed down. The leader laughed, but this time it wasn't as strong as before. "Let's go, boys," he said after a moment, his voice less cocky. "She's not worth it." Clara stood still as the sound of footsteps slowly faded. The rumble of the motorcycles soon followed, their engines roaring down the street and disappearing into the distance. She let out a slow breath, her fingers loosening their grip on Max's leash. "Good boy," she whispered, patting his head. Max wagged his tail lightly, but his eyes stayed focused ahead, making sure the danger was truly gone. Clara took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and continued walking. She didn't let fear hold her back. She knew this town, and she knew herself. And she knew one thing for sure: those men had no idea who they had just messed with. The bikers thought they had an easy target. To them, Clara was just a blind woman walking with her dog. They laughed and joked, thinking she was helpless, weak, and scared. But what they didn't know was that Clara was far from ordinary. She had secrets they would never expect. Max, her loyal guide dog, wasn't just any dog. He was a retired canine, trained to take down criminals and protect those in danger. Max had spent years working with police officers, sniffing out danger, chasing down bad guys, and keeping his handler safe. Even though he was now Clara's guide dog, his instincts were still sharp. He could sense when trouble was near, and right now, he knew these men were not friendly. And Clara? She might have been blind, but she was far from weak. She had something most people didn't: heightened senses. Because she couldn't see, her other senses were sharper. She could hear small sounds that others missed, smell things that most people wouldn't notice, and feel the tiniest changes in the air. That made her a valuable asset to law enforcement. She had worked with the police in the past, using her special skills to help solve cases. She could tell when someone was lying just by listening to their voice, and she could detect danger even before it happened. As the bikers circled her, Clara felt Max's body stiffen. His growl was low, almost too soft for anyone else to hear, but Clara heard it loud and clear. It was his way of telling her, "Be ready. Something's not right." Clara tightened her grip on his leash. Her fingers slid into her coat pocket, feeling for the small, round button hidden inside. It was a special device the police had given her. One press, and it would send a silent signal to the nearest officer, letting them know she needed help. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm. She pressed the button. No sound, no flashing light, just a quiet signal sent through the air. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely louder than a breath, "on alert." The moment he heard those words, Max's whole body changed. His muscles tensed, his ears perked up, and his eyes locked onto the man closest to Clara. Max was no longer just a guide dog, he was ready for action. The bikers kept laughing, unaware of what was happening. They didn't know that help was already on the way. They didn't know that Max was watching their every move, ready to defend Clara in an instant. One of the bikers stepped even closer, his leather jacket brushing against Clara's arm. "You scared, lady?" he sneered. "You should be." Clara didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, listening carefully. She could hear his breath fast and nervous. He was pretending to be tough, but Clara could tell he wasn't as brave as he wanted to seem. Max's growl grew louder this time, a warning that even the biker couldn't ignore. The man stepped back slightly, eyeing the dog warily. "Hey, keep that thing under control," he muttered. Clara smiled, though it wasn't a friendly smile. "Max only reacts to threats," she said calmly. "Are you a threat?" The biker's friends laughed, but Clara could hear the hesitation in their voices. They were starting to wonder if they had made a mistake. But their leader wasn't ready to give up. He crossed his arms and smirked. "What's a blind lady gonna do to us?" he said mockingly. "Call the cops." Clara didn't answer. She just stood there, calm and still, waiting. She knew it wouldn't be long before the police arrived. Max remained alert, his eyes locked on the leader. Clara could feel his energy, ready to spring into action if needed. She reached down and gave him a gentle pat, silently reminding him to stay patient. Seconds passed. Then a minute. The bikers were getting restless. One of them shifted from foot to foot, looking down the street. Clara heard the sound of tires in the distance. They were coming. Another biker nudged his friend. "Maybe we should go," he muttered under his breath. Clara didn't say a word. She let the tension build, letting them sweat. She could sense their growing unease. Then, in the distance, the faint wail of a siren broke the air. The bikers froze. Clara heard it clearly, and so did Max. His tail wagged slightly, but he stayed in place. The leader of the gang cursed under his breath, glancing around. "Let's get out of here," he snapped. The group hurried back to their motorcycles, their boots scuffing against the pavement. Engines roared to life, and in a matter of seconds, they were gone, leaving behind only the smell of gasoline and the fading sound of their laughter. Clara let out a slow breath, feeling Max relax beside her. She reached down and scratched behind his ear. "Good boy," she whispered. Moments later, a police car pulled up beside her, and the window rolled down. "Clara, are you all right?" a familiar voice called out. It was Officer Daniels, one of the local cops who knew Clara well. "I'm fine," Clara said with a small smile. "Just another day." Officer Daniels got out of the car and looked around. "Did they touch you? Threaten you?" Clara shook her head. "No, they were just trying to scare me. But Max handled it. The officer looked down at Max and smiled. I bet he did, he said. You've got the best partner in town. Clara smiled and nodded. That I do. The officer took a quick look around the area, making sure everything was safe. We'll keep an eye out for them, he said. But I think they'll think twice before bothering you again. Clara nodded and thanked him before continuing her walk home, Max by her side. As she walked, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. People often saw her as weak, but today she had proven once again that she was far from helpless. With Max by her side and her own sharp senses, she could handle anything that came her way. She reached her house, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Max flopped down on the floor, letting out a deep sigh of relief. Clara smiled and sat down beside him, running her hand through his soft fur. We did good today, Max, she said softly. Max wagged his tail, and Clara knew they had won this round. But deep down, she also knew this wouldn't be the last time trouble came their way. And when it did, they'd be ready together. The leader of the bikers stepped closer to Clara, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement. Clara could feel him looming over her, his breath hot and heavy in the cold morning air. Listen here, lady, he sneered. We don't like people who don't respect us. Clara stood still, her face calm. She could hear the other bikers shifting around her, their nervous shuffles and low whispers giving them away. But she didn't move. She waited, knowing that Max was ready. Then, the biker leader reached out. His rough hand moved toward Clara's shoulder, fingers curling as if to grab her. But before he could touch her, Max lunged. With lightning speed, the powerful dog leaped forward. His strong jaws clamped onto the biker's arm, locking down with a firm grip. The man let out a loud, startled scream, his voice filled with pain and shock. What the? Get this dog off me, he yelled, stumbling backward. Max held tight, his growl deep and menacing. His body was tense, muscles flexing as he pinned the man in place. Clara could feel the vibrations of Max's growl through the leash, and she knew he had everything under control. The other bikers froze, their laughter gone. Clara could hear their breathing quicken, their feet shuffling backward. They had never expected something like this. Whoa, whoa, let him go, one of them shouted, panicking. But Clara didn't panic. Instead, she stood tall, gripping her cane. But this wasn't just an ordinary cane. With a quick flick of her wrist, it extended and locked into place, revealing a hidden baton. I warned you, Clara said, her voice steady and firm. The bikers were stunned. They had thought Clara was weak, helpless, an easy target. But now, standing in front of them was a woman who was strong, fearless, and in complete control. Before they could do anything, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. The sharp wails grew louder and louder, getting closer with every passing second. Red and blue lights flashed at the end of the street. The bikers panicked. Cops, one of them yelled. Let's get out of here, another shouted, turning to run. But it was too late. Police cars screeched to a stop all around them, blocking every exit. Doors flew open, and officers poured out, their weapons drawn and voices commanding. Hands up! Don't move, an officer shouted. The bikers had no choice. They raised their hands, their faces filled with fear and confusion. They had been caught, and they knew it. Clara relaxed her grip on Max's leash, and with a single command, release, Max let go of the biker's arm and stepped back, standing protectively in front of Clara. The man collapsed onto the pavement, holding his arm and groaning in pain. A police officer approached Clara with a big smile. It was Officer Daniels, someone Clara had worked with many times before. He looked at Max and gave an approving nod. Perfect timing as always, Clara. And Max? Outstanding work, he said, kneeling down to give Max a pat on the head. Max wagged his tail proudly but kept his eyes on the bikers. The officers quickly handcuffed the bikers and shoved them into the back of the squad cars. The leader, still holding his sore arm, glared at Clara. Who are you?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Clara smiled slightly. "Just a blind woman walking her dog," she said simply, but there was a knowing look on her face. Officer Daniels chuckled and turned to the other officers. "Let's take them in. This gang has been smuggling drugs into our community for months. Thanks to Clara and Max, we finally have enough evidence to put them away for good." One of the younger officers looked at Clara in amazement. "You mean, she's been helping us all along?" he asked. Officer Daniels nodded. "Clara has better instincts than most of us. Her hearing, her sense of smell, and her sharp mind helped us gather information without these guys ever suspecting a thing." The young officer looked at Clara with newfound respect. "That's incredible," he said. Clara nodded modestly. "Just doing my part," she said. Max wagged his tail again, as if he understood exactly what was happening. Clara reached down and scratched behind his ears. "Couldn't have done it without you, buddy," she whispered. As the police cars pulled away, taking the bikers with them, the street grew quiet again. Clara took a deep breath, feeling relief wash over her. Officer Daniels stayed behind for a moment. "You okay, Clara?" he asked gently. Clara smiled. "I'm fine. I knew Max and I could handle it." He nodded. "We'll make sure they don't bother you again. And Clara, thanks again. You're braver than most people I know." Clara chuckled softly. "I've had a lot of practice." With that, she and Max continued their walk, as if nothing had happened. People who had watched from their windows now peeked out, whispering to each other in awe. "That blind lady, she's a hero," someone said. But Clara didn't need praise. She just walked confidently down the street, her cane tapping the pavement, and Max walking proudly beside her. Deep down, she knew this wouldn't be the last time she faced trouble. But with Max by her side, she was ready for anything. As they reached their house, Clara gave Max one last pat. "We did it, Max," she said with a smile. "Again." Max wagged his tail happily, knowing that no matter what came next, he and Clara were an unstoppable team. As the last of the bikers were pushed into the back of the police cars, the flashing red and blue lights painted the street in bright colors. The loud roar of their motorcycles was gone, replaced by the hum of quiet voices and the soft rustle of leaves in the chilly breeze. Clara stood tall, her hand gently resting on Max's head. The golden retriever, always alert and ready, wagged his tail slowly, sensing that the danger had passed. Clara knelt down beside Max, running her fingers through his soft fur. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice filled with warmth and pride. Max let out a small, happy woof, his tongue hanging out in a doggy smile. Clara knew Max had been ready to protect her no matter what. He wasn't just a guide dog, he was her best friend, her guardian, and her silent hero. Suddenly, a sound filled the air, clapping. Clara turned her head slightly, listening carefully. More people had gathered around the street, watching everything unfold. Some of them were clapping, and a few even cheered. Murmurs of surprise and amazement filled the air as people realized what had just happened. "I can't believe it," a woman's voice said. "She took down those bikers without even seeing them." "She's incredible," another voice whispered. Clara felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to so much attention. Most of the time, people saw her as just the blind woman with the dog. They thought she was fragile, someone who needed help all the time. But now, those same people were looking at her differently. She could hear their footsteps shuffling closer. A child's voice piped up, full of wonder. "Mom, is that dog a superhero?" The mother laughed softly. "I think he just might be," she said. Clara smiled and stood up, holding her cane firmly. She faced the crowd, standing proud and strong. She didn't need to see their faces to feel their admiration. "Are you okay, Clara?" a familiar voice called out. It was Mr. Thompson, the kind old man who ran the grocery store on the corner. "I'm fine," Clara replied with a nod. "Thanks to Max." Mr. Thompson chuckled. "Well, I always knew you were tough, but I never imagined you'd take down a whole gang of bikers." Clara shrugged playfully. "I guess they picked the wrong person to mess with." A young teenager stepped forward, looking at Clara with wide eyes. "I thought you needed help all the time," he said honestly. "But you didn't need help at all." Clara smiled kindly. "Everyone needs help sometimes," she said. "But just because I can't see doesn't mean I'm weak." The boy nodded slowly, understanding something he hadn't before. Meanwhile, the bikers sat in the police cars, their faces full of defeat. Some of them looked angry, others just shocked. They had thought Clara was an easy target. They had laughed at her, made fun of her, and believed they could scare her. But now, they realized how wrong they were. One of the bikers,